Greetings and welcome to a rather interesting talk. Now, the balloon popped just before, and I swear I had nothing to do with that, first of all, but you all jumped, and I could hear that from backstage. Imagine if that didn't provoke fear in you. Today's talk is about a person who is literally fearless. So the person in question has been given the sort of nickname SM, or SM046, if you want to look her up. When she was about 30 years old, she's now in her late 40s, she was walking home one night and a man grabbed her, pulled her to a park bench and held a knife to her throat. Nearby there was a church that was finishing up some choir practice. And so what does she do? She just remains completely calm, doesn't flinch, doesn't panic, doesn't show any physical response other than obviously the movement towards the attacker, and just says calmly, if you're going to kill me, you're going to have to go through my God's angels first because of the church over the road. Now, I've never attacked anyone, but I imagine that if I did, and I was holding a knife to someone's throat, and they didn't react, I would panic. And that's what happened to her attacker. He panics and just is like, this is too crazy for me, and off he goes and leaves her alone. She had no hesitation walking back there the next day and continued to take that path home afterwards. So SM suffers from a particular disorder called Urbach-Viter disease. Now, I'm probably mispronouncing that because it's one of those things that I've only ever read, never actually heard anyone formally pronounce. This is an autosomal recessive disorder for those geneticists amongst you, and it is one that affects roughly, they think, about 500 people worldwide. So it's not a common disorder. One of the key characteristics, or one of the visible symptoms of it, is a bubbling around the eyelids, as you can see in the image there. It's not the only observable symptom. There's also a raspy voice because of the hardening of the vocal cords, and then slow wound healing and other things. But one of the key characteristics is that when the person who suffers from this disorder reaches puberty, parts of their brain often start to calcify, so they literally turn to bone. And it's usually in the temporal lobe, and sometimes it's very specific to the amygdala, which is shown in blue here. Now, that part of the brain is thought to be solely responsible for producing the emotion fear. And so SM, who's had both of her amygdala destroyed through this disorder, is literally fearless. Not someone who's figuratively fearless or fearless in certain situations. She literally cannot feel fear. This has all sorts of quirky repercussions. Now, it's worth noting that we feel fear because it's protective. So from an evolutionary standpoint, fear means that we won't get ourselves into a dangerous situation. SM is actually, her life is evidence that fear is good for us. She has been held up at knife point. She's been held up at gunpoint. She's been nearly killed through domestic violence and yet still felt fine returning to that household because she wasn't afraid. So fear is very important and protective for us. When we say something is evolutionary in nature, we refer to that as being related to the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, feeding and mating. For those who went somewhere else with that last one, the word is fornication, not where you went. Now, SM has a complete blind spot for fear. She cannot feel fear herself, but she cannot recognise fear in the facial expressions of other people. She cannot draw a fearful face. It is thought, this is Ekman's research, that the ability to recognise facial expressions is universal. So it doesn't matter what culture you're from, what part of the world you're from, you will be able to recognise and tell the emotional state of the facial expressions that are shown, for example, in this image. So let's have a quick look. Which one is the face of sadness? And which one is the face of disgust? And which one is the fearful face? Very good. So SM will be able to recognise all those other emotions, but not the fearful face. And it's also worth noting that, say, the expression is universal, but what causes, say, surprise in a Japanese person may not be the same as what causes surprise in an American person. So what causes the emotion is very different, but the facial expression is the same. So how do you induce fear? SM signs up for this stuff because she doesn't know that she should be afraid. And so ethics around this is all really grey and murky. But they have taken her on scary tours, like scary movies, haunted houses, ghost tours. They've shown her images of dangerous creatures and actually taken her to like an exotic pet store and asked her to handle dangerous creatures. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. Now, scary movies. I always like to show this next slide because this actually tells you what those scary movies are that they've shown and the particular scenes and things as well. So you can see that there's a description of which scenes from a movie, which ones are scary. And you can see in the graph here that SM's response is almost nil. And the scenes where she does have a response, so getting to a rating of 1 out of 8 in terms of a fear response, you could, if you look at the scenes and the detail, perhaps some surprise or disgust or other emotion is also perhaps feeding into that. It's worth noting the healthy comparisons. So not only did they show them to these scary scenes to SM and gauge her response, they showed them to volunteers and also gauge their response. So imagine signing up for that study. Hey, you want to sign up for a study on fear? All you got to do is come in and we'll scare you. The SM, you can see her emotional response to movies and to video clips is normal, with the exception of here. So the surprise, happiness, and disgust, she actually has a heightened response in comparison to a healthy control group. But note that her fear response, and this is the average of the previous slide, is next to nil. So there's the 0. It's just a tiny bit above that, which, as you can see on the previous slide, because of those bits. But we'll talk more about her hyper response to things in a moment. When you feel fear, I'll rephrase. When you were raised, how many times did your parents say, don't touch that, look out for that? Often you ignore them when you don't know. But, they say all this stuff, and they're always telling you what you need to pay attention to. So when you actually show SM something that she should be afraid of, her brain still says, pay attention to that. But in the absence of a fear response, it manifests not as fear, like back away, but as an intense, they said it was a compulsive curiosity. So when she was taken to the exotic pet store and asked would she mind handling, like beforehand, yes, I know snakes are dangerous, yes, I know spiders are dangerous, and they should be avoided, and that's what she's taught her sons. But then when she gets there, it manifests as an intense curiosity. So she was the sort of person who would pick up the snake and not just hold it like a normal person would, well away, but hold it right up to her face, start playing with its tongue and touching it without any hesitation. To the point where when they kept sort of asking her if she wanted to handle like bigger snakes or more dangerous spiders, they actually wound up having to restrain her because such was her compulsive curiosity that she wanted to go to the next more dangerous thing. And the way she was handling them was not the way the animals are used to being handled. And so it was actually putting her at risk because she was actually wanting to grab the more dangerous things before the people were ready and holding it up to her face and doing all sorts of weird stuff. But I do find that curious, that in the absence of fear, curiosity flourishes. And I think that's an interesting point. Now, when they did a review of research into SM, they found that all of the previous studies over some 20 years had referred to an external source of fear. The scary movie, the haunted mansion, that sort of stuff. Incidentally, on the haunted tours, where they, if anyone's ever done like a tour of, say, like a Fremantle prison over in Perth, they have people who come out and do jump scares at you. She was leading the group, going, come on, come on, come on. And she was scaring the people who were paid to scare the group. Because she was jumping out and going, it manifested as curiosity. So she would go straight up to the person who'd just done the jump scare and was scaring them, which was really quite interesting. But they noticed all this had been from an external source. So they then thought, well, they hypothesised, like good scientists do, put forward a hypothesis. Let's design some research which can then test this hypothesis. And they said that we think that she will feel no fear from an internal source either. This was their working theory. So the question then becomes, well, how do you induce an internal source of fear in a human? And there's really two ways. One, pain, like strong pain, is one way of inducing fear. The second is what they did with SM and 2 other volunteers for the study, and a control group who also volunteered for the study who did know better because they were normal, healthy people. So they hooked them up to a breathing mask and fed her air that was 35% carbon dioxide. This basically told every cell in her body that it was suffocating. And every cell in her body screamed to her brain, I'm suffocating. To the researchers' great surprise, and even more surprise to the 3 volunteers with this disorder, they actually felt fear. And this was an unbelievable finding. What's more, compared to the control group, their fear response was almost the same size, like say 7.8 versus 8, like almost the same size response. However, the control group, that's all they did. They felt fear. But the 3 people with this disorder and the destroyed amygdala actually had panic attacks. Imagine you've gone for 20, 30 years of your life without feeling fear at all to suddenly feeling it again. They actually had panic attacks. Now again, ethics, but what I really find fascinating is that this indicates that there's actually a separate way of processing internal sources of fear compared to an external source. And so there's not just one type of fear that to an external stimulus, but 2 types of fear. And I think that's quite an interesting idea. SM's disorder also has numerous impacts on her personality. She is very positive. She has what's called a positive affect, which is a psychological term. Basically, it means that she has a I'm okay, you're okay kind of attitude to everyone. She's very friendly, very trusting, is quite okay with having a stranger, someone she's never met, come up and even rub noses or do anything like that. Like that doesn't bother her in the slightest. So she's very friendly. This can lead to an increase in gullibility because she's very trusting, because she doesn't know that, hang on, I should be afraid, I should be cautious. So she can be a little bit gullible. She has a normal IQ, but this hasn't affected her intelligence. Her IQ is 86, which is still in the normal range. Average is 100, 85 to 115 is normal range. So she's at the lower end, but in the normal range. So with that personality, she has what's called a really good theory of mind. So she's very good at recognising emotions in other people. So if we saw the slide earlier where it showed her responses, except for fear, which she has a complete blind spot for, she is exceptional at recognising the emotional state of other people and responding appropriately to it, which I find particularly interesting. This also leads to what is called hyper-empathy. So studies with SM and other people who've had their amygdala destroyed for, say, lesion, for example, to control epilepsy, so not as a result of Urbach-Weiter disease, but for other reasons, there seems to then be this case of an emergence of hyper-empathy, which I find particularly fascinating. Now, when my son was born, or when I even found out that my wife was pregnant, I actually really worried about how do I teach my son compassion? How do I teach him empathy? Is that something that can be taught? And I worried about that because I wanted my son to be, a good, upstanding member of the community. Now, what this research suggests is that I don't actually need to teach empathy, that if I provide a safe environment, in other words, an environment where the child won't be exposed to too much fear, that empathy will flourish. And that to me is really profound and something that is really worth sort of thinking about, that you don't have to teach empathy. If you provide a safe environment, then empathy will flourish naturally. So me being me, I tend to overthink things, came up with this theory. How to make the world a better place. And so start with fear removal. Fear removal leads to increased empathy and compassion, as studies on SM and other people with destroyed amygdala show. That leads to increased happiness. Numerous studies, particularly on those with Buddhist monks, show that if you practice compassion, that it genuinely makes you a happier person. It also leads to increased social participation, as studies on SM, SP, who's another individual with this disorder, and people with depression, where the withdrawal, sort of the reverse of that. So it shows that people will increase their social participation, which leads to increased cooperation. Numerous studies show that just having the mere exposure to another ethnic group or minority can reduce prejudice and discrimination. So if someone's more active in their society, it will lead to improved contact with other groups or with groups that you might otherwise be afraid of. That, again, is enough to reduce the fear response and letting in, and so you get this wonderful cycle. So that was my little idea there. So that's my talk. Thank you.